What happens when a lone Navy veteran is cornered by a gang of ruthless bikers on an empty desert highway? They think they've found easy prey, but what unfolds next flips the script in the most unexpected way. The Arizona sun blazed relentlessly over the desert highway, its heat shimmering off the asphalt. James Jim Carter, a 62-year-old Navy veteran, crouched beside his classic black motorcycle. The bike, a labor of love, gleamed despite the dust, a testament to the care Jim gave it. His faded jacket bore a single patch. SEAL Team 6 retired. It wasn't a boast, just a fact. With a practiced hand, Jim tightened the chain, focused and unbothered by the heat. He'd been on this road long enough to appreciate its quiet, but that peace was shattered by a deep, rumbling growl. Engines, multiple, growing louder. He glanced up briefly as a group of bikers came into view, their chrome machines gleaming like predators on the prowl. They rolled up close, their laughter cutting through the stillness. Jim stayed calm, finishing his adjustments as the group came to a stop just feet away. The leader, a tall, scruffy man with a patch that read Rex, swung off his bike, his grin smug and full of bad intentions. "Hey, old man," Rex called, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from having backup. "What are you doing out here, breaking down on our turf?" Jim straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't know highways were private property," he replied, his voice even. Rex stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "See, we've had problems. Strangers poking where they don't belong. You one of those?" Jim met Rex's eyes, unflinching. "Just passing through, fixing my bike." The bikers closed ranks, their laughter growing louder. Rex smirked, clearly enjoying the show. "Well, maybe we can help you out, for a fee, of course." Jim's expression didn't change. "Help's not needed." Rex's grin faded slightly, replaced by something harder. "That's not how it works around here." One of the younger bikers, eager to impress, stepped forward and kicked over Jim's toolbox. Wrenches and bolts scattered across the asphalt. The group erupted into laughter again, but Jim remained composed, crouching to pick up the tools without a word. "Oh, did we scare you?" one of them jeered, his voice dripping with mockery. Rex raised a hand, silencing the group. His tone was quieter now, more menacing. "Let's see some ID, Grandpa. We've got rules out here." Jim stood, tools in hand. "Not happening." The calm in his voice gave Rex pause, but only for a moment. He stepped closer, his grin returning. "What, you got something to hide?" A car approached in the distance, its driver slowing to take in the scene. For a moment, it felt like help might come, but the car quickly sped off, leaving a swirl of dust in its wake. Rex laughed, shaking his head. "Looks like no one's coming to save you." Jim turned fully to face him, his stance steady and unshaken. "You should let me finish my work and be on your way." The group fell silent, Rex's smirk faltering under the weight of Jim's gaze. But he couldn't let it show. Turning to his crew, he spread his arms wide. "Hear that, boys? He thinks we should leave." Their laughter returned, echoing through the desert. Then, with a dramatic flourish, Rex reached for his belt, pulling out a knife. The blade gleamed in the sunlight as he twirled it lazily, his grin growing darker. "Let's teach this guy what happens when you don't respect our rules." The laughter stopped again, replaced by a tense silence. Jim didn't move, his calm composure only adding to the pressure in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but razor sharp. "You sure you want to do this?" For a moment, even the desert seemed to hold its breath. The sun was sinking, casting long shadows across the highway. The air felt thick, heavy with tension, as if even the desert knew what was coming. Jim stood steady, his eyes locked on Rex, who waved the knife like a showman trying to keep the crowd entertained. But Rex wasn't fooling anyone, least of all Jim. "Old man, you deaf?" Rex sneered, his confidence slipping under Jim's unshaken calm. "You're in our world now." Jim's voice cut through the heat like a cold blade. "You sure about that?" That sentence hung in the air, pulling every ounce of bravado from Rex's crew. The laughter stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy named Dale who still had the sense not beaten out of him, murmured, "Boss, maybe we should just let him go." Rex turned on him, the glare of a man too deep into his own ego to back down. "You want to walk home, kid? Keep quiet." Jim knelt again, picking up a wrench that had fallen from his scattered toolbox. His movements were deliberate, like a lion stretching before the hunt. He straightened up slowly, holding the tool casually in his hand. "You boys think this is a game," he says Thapshed, his tone almost conversational. "But you don't know what you're playing with." Rex smirked, his grin forced, his voice louder now, trying to reclaim the authority slipping away. "Oh, we're shaking, Grandpa." Before the last word even faded, Rex lunged, the knife aimed high. The air seemed to still for half a heartbeat. Then, in one fluid motion, Jim sidestepped, his hands snapping out like a whip. He caught Rex's wrist and twisted it with practiced precision. The knife hit the ground with a metallic clang, and Rex let out a sharp yelp of pain, stumbling back. The bikers froze, their bravado evaporating like mist under the desert sun. Jim released Rex's wrist and stepped back, his expression as calm as if he'd just finished adjusting his bike chain. Rex staggered, cradling his wrist, his face red with pain and humiliation. "What the hell?" Rex snarled, trying to sound tough, but the quiver in his voice gave him away. One of the bikers, a bulky man with a chain dangling from his belt, stepped forward hesitantly. "You all right, Rex?" "Stay back," Rex barked, his voice cracking. But Jim didn't move toward him. He stood there, still and controlled, his very presence daring anyone to make the next mistake. "You got two choices," Jim said, his voice steady and firm, not a hint of anger. "Walk away now, or learn why I wore this patch." For the first time, the group noticed the insignia on Jim's jacket. Dale leaned closer to another biker and whispered, "Boss, that patch, he's military." But Rex wasn't listening. His pride wouldn't let him. He turned back toward his bike, yanking a tire iron from the side. "I don't care who he is. He doesn't scare me." Jim sighed, his face carrying the weight of a man who'd seen this too many times. "You don't have to be scared," he said softly, almost to himself. "Just smart." Rex charged again, the tire iron raised, his crew too stunned or too scared to stop him. But Jim was faster. Before Rex could even swing, Jim stepped forward, deflecting the blow and spinning him around. In a blur, Rex was on the ground, his arm pinned behind his back. He yelled out, but Jim didn't press harder than he needed to. The message was clear. Jim was in complete control. The bikers stood frozen, their confidence shattered. The man they'd underestimated had just dismantled their leader in seconds. Jim looked up at the rest of them, his voice calm but firm. "You boys done?" Dale took a step back, raising his hands in surrender. The others exchanged uneasy glances, muttering to each other but making no move to help Rex. Even they could see the fight was over. Jim released Rex and stood, watching as the man scrambled to his feet, holding his arm like a wounded animal. He turned to the bikers, his voice low but commanding. "Take your friend. Get out of here." The bikers stood motionless, their bravado draining away like water in the desert sun. Their leader, Rex, lay crumpled on the ground, clutching his arm and glaring up at Jim like a wounded animal. His humiliation was palpable, but none of his crew dared move. Finally, Dale broke the silence, his voice shaky but sincere. Who are you?" Jim stood tall, brushing the dust off his faded jacket. His voice was steady, almost casual. "Just a guy fixing his bike." Rex scrambled awkwardly to his feet, his pale face a mix of anger and fear. He turned to his crew, his voice breaking as he barked, "What are you waiting for? Get him!" But the bikers didn't budge. Even the loudest of them, the ones who had laughed the hardest earlier, seemed rooted to the spot. Dale looked at Rex, then at Jim, shaking his head. "Boss, I think we're out of our depth." Jim took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Rex. It wasn't threatening, just unyielding. "You should have walked away when you had the chance," Jim said, his voice calm but heavy with finality. Rex froze, his chest heaving, and then, faint but unmistakable, the sound of sirens began to echo in the distance. The bikers turned their heads, the sudden realization of what was coming written all over their faces. Rex's bravado crumbled entirely. His eyes darted toward his bike, panic creeping into his voice. "This isn't over," he spat, backing away. Jim didn't flinch. "Leave now," he said firmly, "and maybe I won't tell them what happened here." For a moment, Rex hesitated, his pride wrestling with the reality of his situation. But the growing sound of the sirens made the decision for him. He mounted his bike, motioning for the others to follow. "Let's go," he growled. The gang obeyed, their engines roaring to life as they peeled away, leaving a haze of exhaust and a silence heavier than the desert heat. Jim turned back to his bike, crouching down to finish the repair as if nothing had happened. His movements were as deliberate and calm as they'd been before the bikers arrived. By the time the police cruiser pulled up, the chain was back in place, and Jim was wiping his hands clean. A young officer stepped out of the vehicle, her uniform crisp, despite the oppressive heat. She surveyed the scene cautiously, her eyes narrowing at the scattered tools and the faint dust cloud left by the fleeing bikers. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her voice professional but curious. Jim stood, reaching into his pocket and handing over his ID without being asked. "Better now," he replied. The officer studied the ID, her expression shifting as she read the credentials. Her eyes widened slightly before she looked up at him, her demeanor softening. "You're Navy SEAL?" Jim gave a small nod. "Retired." The officer shook her head, a hint of a smile breaking through her serious expression. "Looks like those guys didn't know who they were messing with." Jim chuckled quietly, a sound that carried the weight of experience and the ease of a man who had nothing left to prove. "They rarely do." The officer handed back his ID, her respect clear in her tone. "Safe travels," she said before climbing back into her cruiser and driving off. Jim started his bike, the engine purring like it was ready to hit the open road again. With one last look at the now empty stretch of highway, he pulled onto the asphalt. The roar of his motorcycle filled the air as he disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind nothing but a faint trail of dust and a lesson those bikers wouldn't forget anytime soon.